So, as it happens, Paddy is in Texas. Now, he's not actually in Texas checking out tariffs. However, I'm hoping he'll come back with exciting reports of what it was being like being in the United States the week that the United States changed the world. So, instead of Paddy, I'm delighted to be joined by two very, very, very superior companions for Saturday afternoon. And I've been suggested to call them the formers, but I think that's rude. However, if I was going to say the former, I would say Stephanie Flanders, a former BBC economics editor, and Justin Webb, the former BBC America editor. And they've also said I should say I'm the former political editor, but I think it's much more fun for you to introduce yourselves with the excellent jobs you do now. So, Stephanie.
I am now head of economics and politics at Bloomberg and also host of the Trumponomics podcast, which becomes more and more relevant by the week.
That was a good early spot. And Justin, as if you need an introduction.
Well, look, I'm happy to be former. I'm very former, but I present for my sins, or one of the presenters of Americast. And, we have had a year where a podcast that I thought, I wonder if that'll last for a month or two, be fun to do, has now taken over most of my life. There you go.
There you go. And that humble little Radio 4 programme today. Well, let's get on with the Saturday edition of Newscast, a very special one for you coming up.
Newscast from the BBC.
So it's Laura in the studio.
Stephanie Flanders also in the studio.
And Justin Webb at home in South London.
So it's 2:05 on Saturday afternoon. And frankly, by the time you're listening to this newscast, there's who knows what will have happened. But the UK is now subject to a 10% tariff in the United States. It's been in force for 9 hours. And Stephanie, you've covered all this stuff for a long, long time, but have you been able to believe your eyes, or have you been, bleaching them with horror?
I mean, I think it certainly showed what we saw happen with financial markets in the last few days, showed that they did actually, it really mattered what the president said in the Rose Garden. Sometimes you have a lot of build up to a statement and people traditionally say, well, the markets have already pre-priced, everything is all priced in. They had no idea that what he was going to announce was going to be so what we would consider extreme. There'd been a debate beforehand. Will he go for a basic tariff for everybody, maybe raise him some money, a sort of price of admission to the US market, or will he really go for what he'd suggested, these very variable rates of tariffs that would be much higher? And then he ended up doing both, which I don't think anybody had anticipated, and also sending a lot of signals that this was going to be, for the duration. Now, we know from experience that may not be the case, but it was a very significant shock. And then you saw that play out in the fall in stock markets around the world.
And just dummy's guide, if you forgive me, how is this so problematic for just the cost of doing business, just as simple as you can?
It is charging an extra price of admission for anything coming into the US. And in a world where supply chains have become very complicated and big global companies, especially the big, most successful American companies, have based their entire business model around that global economy kind of continuing, to suddenly bring in not just, a little bit of grit in the wheels, just the odd 1%, 2%, but 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% charges on the value of things when they reach the border is for companies that often will have relatively narrow margins, this sends them right back to the drawing board. Can I even continue to sell to the US?
So it might smash up the business models.
I mean, in some cases.
Is that?
In other cases, it'll be, when it's a relatively small tariff, it's the 10%, things will carry on. But it's still, it could be a big hit to the price of things in the shops, and certainly to the price for the importers bringing it in.
And that then, Justin, takes it right to the American pocketbook. So how do you think the politics of this have been in the last 24, 36 hours? And what do you see happening next? Because it's interesting, even Ted Cruz, prominent Republican, has been out there. Scaramucci, who I know you know well on Americast, is suggesting that Trump could be America's Liz Truss over before he's even got started.
Well, Scaramucci, let's put to one side because he's not a great fan of Donald Trump. But let's take the people who are fans of Donald Trump.
And has a competing podcast, I might say.
Yeah, competing podcast. Look, Ted Cruz, you're right, would normally not step out of line, particularly at this early stage of a policy, but has already said, this can't go on for too long. A few other Republicans as well, particularly people representing farming states who are kind of taking a double hit, because you think of import tariffs, well, that in fact affects a lot of machinery that they might buy abroad. But of course, the retaliatory tariffs will also affect their ability to sell stuff abroad. So they're really worried. And of course, farming states tend to be represented by Republicans. That's just the way modern politics is in the US. So they're already nervous. One or two even voted against, at least in a kind of nominal way, against the policy in the Senate. And this is a Republican Party that in other respects is incredibly disciplined. So what you are seeing is something that is potentially in the longer term pretty serious. On the Democrat side, woohoo, finally, something where they can kind of unite around something and say, whoa, this is a bad policy, or that it's being incompetently done. Because, of course, the Democrats have this slight issue that when he put tariffs on in his first term, they kept most of them, indeed added to some of them, plus a lot of left-wing people in America. You know, Stephanie will know this well from yesteryear, as it was, or yestermonth. It used to be quite a thing, particularly in the union movement in America, to think that tariffs are a good thing, and that was something that some Democratic Party politicians kind of got onto. So there are complications, but fundamentally, yeah, what you're seeing is real nervousness because people are expecting that their constituents are affected, and that's not going to be good for them.
But here's an interesting thing. I mean, I wonder, you said, Stephanie, did Wall Street just not actually believe that Trump would do this?
I mean, it is a theme that we've had, right? Because remember when Donald Trump was elected, and even before that, on the anticipation of his election, Wall Street had done extremely well. And that was kind of betting on all the good stuff he was talking about, at least from a market standpoint, happening, deregulation, tax cuts, all those things.
And he really cares about Wall Street's view.
Yeah, and him
right?
not really doing the tariffs. And of course, as it's sort of become clear that, no, he's really prioritising the stuff that they're a bit nervous about. They're not that keen. I mean, a lot of big businesses are not that keen on clamping down on immigration because they want to have still the access to cheap labour. So I think you've seen all of that increase come off, obviously, before now. And I think just gradually there's been a realization that he's not as focused on the day-to-day of Wall Street as we previously thought. And he really is, and has been for decades, very dedicated to this idea of bringing production back home into the US. And as Justin says, there's plenty of people on the left and right who've wanted to bring back manufacturing to the US. And the Biden administration was investing a lot in manufacturing to try and bring some of these things home. I think what was weird about these tariffs, and I think meant that you still had opposition even among those people, or at least a sort of lack of comprehension, was the comprehensive nature of the tariffs. It's not just on cars and things that you might realistically want to bring home. If you're putting one of the highest tariff rates on a country like Madagascar, whose main exports to the US, you know, a very poor country, is vanilla and spices and coffee. I mean, these aren't industries that the US is going to realistically compete in, and it just looks penal and a bit weird.
What's that about then, Justin, do you think? Is it just the show? Look, I really, really meant it all these years?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, there has always been a side to Donald Trump, and there was in his first administration, but much more in the campaigning and in what we've seen so far of this one, where there is a kind of, you know, someone wrote a piece once saying that the cruelty is the point. And, you know, and whether or not you think it's cruel, one of the things about Trump is the salience of him and his supporters when it comes to kind of biffing the other side, and sometimes doing so in an aggressive manner and not minding too much if there are people who say, look, hang on a second, someone has suffered from this. You look at his immigration policy at the moment, where it may well be that some completely innocent people have been chucked in jail in Central America as a result of a policy. They just don't care. I mean, they really genuinely don't care. In fact, they see it as a good thing. They quite like the idea of the publicity that attaches to kind of violent policies in a sense. So when people say, you know, Madagascar, or they say the Falklands, for goodness sake, they've probably just exported a few mollusks and they've not got roads much in order to drive Chevrolets, so they're not going to import a load of American goods. They don't really care about that sort of stuff. This is not an administration that thinks in those normal political terms.
And of course, sometimes politicians, even here, enjoy the fight, and you do something that it hurts, and because it hurts, not to this extent. I'm not comparing
No,
like
but
with like, but you
I think
do
the
get...
there is a sort of, when you talk about the vibe, I mean, the vibe of just smashing the system is one that we've seen play out, whether in the Brexit vote in the UK, there is a risk, and I think that a lot of a lot of people on the sort of centre of politics, right and left, have always sound like they're defending the institutions and saying everything is right with the world, in a world where there's plenty of people, and certainly supporters of Donald Trump, who think, no, everything is not right.
People in the UK government here who, for the avoidance of doubt, are not on the same political journey as Donald Trump, but do say, look, we don't like the style, we don't like how he goes about it, we don't like how far and how rapidly he has gone, but absolutely have sympathy with that analysis that far too many people have been left behind, to use what's become a bit of a cliche, but is just a really clear term. That's what for many people, the Brexit vote was about. That's why actually this government in the last couple of months has been really leaning into this notion of security, making people feel like they're secure economically, spending more money on defence, and that's leaning into that sense of international sort of security. And I want to talk about the UK and the possible, and hear your take on the possible impact here, Stephanie, in just a second. But we have a classic, excellent newscaster question. Kevin Monaghan wants to know, I'm sorry to pose the most rhetorical of rhetorical questions, but how economically competent is the President of the United States? Did he ever actually study economics at college or university? And Stephanie, this is not, I'm sure Kevin is not trying to sneer at what's happening here, because, liberal disgust is part of what Donald Trump wants to create, right? That works for his political agenda. But do you know if he actually has economic qualifications?
Well, he actually does have, although I have to admit that I was reminded of this by the esteemed newscast team beforehand, because you were very kindly not wanting to put me on the spot. And he did graduate from the Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania in 1968 with a Bachelor of Science in Economics.
That's a very fine business school, Wharton.
It is, although I think it's fair to say, without being in any way derogatory, that Wharton School now is very different from what it was in the 60s. It was somewhat easier to get in then, I think it's fair to say. And he had his first 2 years at a New York university, I think it was Fordham University, and there is some question mark about how he got into University of Pennsylvania, but we will gloss over that. I would say that he has been very consistent in a quite intuitive approach to economics over the last 20, 30 years, going back to the 80s, where he was sounding the alarm about America going on this kind of globalization journey, and was proved right in many areas. And certainly when it came to China and maybe America and the rest of the world having perhaps too much trust that just bringing China into the global economy would kind of make its government more like us and more sort of democratic and put it on a very sensible path. He was completely right on that, and I would say ahead of the curve. So it's not that he's been sort of boneheaded about economics all these years. I think, and as Justin says, there's people like Oren Cass, who actually I've seen in the last couple of days come out broadly in favour of these tariffs, which surprised me a little, who do have a model of how do you step back from that kind of extreme globalization we have, which a lot of countries would share. But it's you want to have, I think that what the questioner is getting at is the delivery of this, the execution of this, does seem a bit cack-handed. I mean, we had reporting that even as they were putting the chairs out in the Rose Garden, they were trying to work out what the numbers were going to be, whether he was going to bring out that chart. There was even the numbers on the chart were not quite the ones that actually were then put out by the White House.
And as
it just looks incompetent.
And you've got to help us with this equation. As it's you, because you're probably one of the only people I know who would be able to look at that and make any sense of it. But is there sense to be made of it?
No, anybody listening to this could make sense of it if they hadn't just put a few Greek letters on it to make it look smarter than it was. It was literally you took the amount of trade that they did with this country, with a country, and then looked at what the surplus the country had. So the amount more that the country sells to the US than the US sells to it. And if it was if the surplus, if the extra was or the excess as far as the US is concerned, was a big share of the total trade. That suggested that they were really unfair. It was unfair trade. They were selling far too many goods to Americans that Americans wanted, that they wanted them too much, and that that country should be punished. And so that's literally what they looked at that number. So one divided by the other, and then they halved it to say, well, actually, they're being generous. But that it was one of the most basic bits of arithmetic. But they clearly, when they thought, well, that looks a bit too simple. So the actual formula they put out, they added various economic sort of algebraic terms in Greek letters, which all summed to one. They made no difference to the calculation, but they just made it look a lot cleverer. But this does go slightly to the sort of competence point.
So that's literally just, it was a branding exercise by sticking alpha, beta, gamma, or whatever it was, and putting it over in some numbers. Well, thank you for explaining.
One divided by the other, divided by two.
There we go. One divided by the other, divided by the other, divided by two. Right, there we go. Let's just talk briefly about the UK. And Stephanie, I'm intrigued to see what your assessment might be of how serious it could be here. And just if people are wondering what's going on this weekend, Keir Starmer's working the phones to European and Commonwealth leaders. We're not expecting at the moment him to talk to Donald Trump again. And there are kind of, I've been describing the government's approach as sort of slow, quick, slow. So in terms of retaliation tariffs, there's zero appetite from conversations I've had in the UK to push ahead with jumping into any kind of whack back at the US or to follow the European Union in the coming days, who we expect to slap some of their own import taxes on American goods. There's no appetite on this at the moment. And the big giveaway is that they're actually formally asking businesses to give them ideas about what they want for 4 weeks. So if they're consulting business for 4 weeks, nothing's going to happen quickly then. What they are hoping still they might be able to get done quickly is this notional trade deal with the US, which, let's be clear, is something that would be a sort of statement of broad principles, not a giant full fat trade deal that would sort out all the problems overnight. But what's intriguing, in the last couple of days, I've been told, literally the calls between the US and Number 10, it's being led out of Number 10 with the business department working on it alongside. They stopped before Liberation Day. And people were saying to me things like, the ball's in their court. We're expecting to hear from them any moment now. And as I understand it, when we're recording 2:25 on Saturday, those calls have not yet resumed. So there's definitely, I've detected a nervousness in government about, in all the turmoil, does the possibility of an economic deal between the US and UK become a sort of don't call us, we'll call you? Like, just can they get to it with everything going on?
And I think it's a question that's raised by the sort of extremity of these tariffs, is whether that is the next move, as opposed to, I don't know. So we've gone from sort of obsequious approach to the Donald Trump, which was reasonably successful, and then sort of the do nothing strategy and hope that you don't get hit too hard. I guess the question for the Prime Minister is, can you do a sort of more muscular non-retaliation, which actually involves working with other countries, a bit like the kind of coalition of the willing idea when it comes to defence and Ukraine? You know, is there something you can proactively do with European countries, with other G7 economies, that's about opening up trade and responding to this in a positive way, rather than seeking to get that? I think there's quite a lot of governments now that are questioning, ironically, given that he's supposed to be the great businessman, is this a president we can do business with? Because you do a deal with him one day and then he'll renege on it the next.
Yeah.
And so if I were Number 10, I'd be sort of asking myself is that really the priority, to do a deal when actually he's still going to be at war with all these other countries, China and Europe particularly, who are very important trading partners for the UK, and it will damage us if he's at war with them.
And the other cold reality that's well known in government is that any deal we might be able to get is maybe a partial little sweetening of the whole economic turmoil. But if this turns into a whole big blow up right across the worldwide economy, it's not going to be an effective shield from our economy to that, because we're so connected with all the other bits of the economy. The other thing that the government's doing, though, is pushing to see if some of the things they're already planning can be speeded up. So there's a conversation going on this weekend about whether or not they can bring forward any of what's called the capital spending, or that's expected in the spending review. Can they get on with any of that earlier? Do they have to wait till June? Might they be able to rush forward what's known as the industrial strategy, which is the plan, again, is expected in June, to do more to invest in UK infrastructure? So there's this kind of slow, quick, slow thing going on with how they try to manage this. But Justin, just as your American insights, it reminds us so eloquently often, Do they actually care that much about what's going on in the UK?
The answer to that is no, not a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, it's an interesting point that on the American right, where there has been historically a kind of sense, a sort of Mayflower sense of fellow feeling with the Brits, and that they assume that we, when Her Majesty the Queen was alive, they assumed that we all knew her and kind of took tea with her, et cetera, et cetera. And that has been a theme of American life, and anyone who's been to America, particularly the flyover states, the middle states, will know that. But what I've picked up in recent years on the right in America is a growing hostility, actually, to us. It's not that they don't care about us, it's they actively don't like us. And you see all these stories now about what they see as our failure to stand up for freedom of speech, which are being very much circulated around America. It's really interesting how on the right in America, they know an awful lot about the police interviewing Alison Pearson, the Daily Telegraph journalist. Mm-hmm. They know an awful lot about other issues that have been in our domestic political life recently.
The anti-abortion protesters, that's been a
the
huge
anti-abortion protester in particular, who was just convicted,
right.
wasn't she, yesterday? And those things, in the age of social media, they rocket around, and they have this impact on the American right of making them feel that actually we are not proper defenders of our civilization, and it kind of. So that their sense of us, I think, has been tinged now with a kind of contempt that actually you wouldn't have felt before. So yeah, not only is there no special relationship, I think to some extent they really don't like us.
And Steph, let's close with you just on the scale of change that we might be about to all live through, because actually someone in Cabinet said sometimes people are slow to realise that you're living through a moment of history, and actually maybe it's here. And we've got a great practical example from Steve Doran, who's a listener, who's saying, I've been running a small business in the northwest of England selling genuine Japanese motor spares for 17 years. I've always sourced these from Florida. The Japanese manufacturer ships all the products from Japan to their distribution centre in Florida. I then buy them from there. Now, not to put you on the spot and say exactly how's it going to work out with Steve, but it's a really good example of just how connected. That's one small business in the northwest of England, Japan, Florida, the UK. How significant is what we're experiencing if Trump sticks to all of this?
I mean, if you take it seriously, it does take us right back to the beginning when we're talking about the complexity of supply chains. And that's a really good example there. And that's even relatively straightforward compared to some of these
only three
things.
countries.
I mean, we have had decades where there's, exporters, there'll be things that they know about, like, as Steve knows about that part of it. When you talk to the Florida distributor, it may turn out it's not just Japan, it's a number of other places. It is literally unmaking an omelette. Everything has gone into this omelette, and you're trying to take out little bits of the egg and put it back to pieces again and put the shell on it again. I mean, and apart from anything else, it's just a horrendous pain in the neck for people like Steve and everyone else. I mean, anyone who complained about sort of EU red tape, the idea that you're going to have to do these rules of origin and that's really going to matter whether it's a 25% or a 10% or a 5%. I mean, that is the tax. We talked about at the start as it's basically a tax or price of doing business. That is the tax that's on every stage of the production chain, and it's even worse if things are going over crossing borders many times. When you look at, we had this even just thinking about the impact on the UK. There's the amount that the UK exports directly to the US, but actually that doesn't tell you that much. It's sort of 0.5% of GDP or something. You actually also need to think about all of the where UK goods are embedded in other exports to the US. So European exports to the US, there's a bit of UK labour that goes into those exports. A bit of a plain wing, exactly, when it comes to Airbus. And then you've also got the other way around. We're bringing in all these things. So to try and unpick that, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think most people in the financial markets think it's not going to be the end of globalization, because there's too much already happened, and there's too many forces within business propelling it, not least technological change. But it may grind to a halt to some degree and produce a lot of very damaging scrambling around.
Justin, will he stick with it?
Okay.
Go on.
That's a really
it's only
unfair
us
question,
three.
because how can you possibly get inside the the mind of this guy. I mean, he is an extraordinary man, and a man who is capable of massive changes of mind and of bringing his supporters with him through all the ups and downs and wiggles to each side of his policies and his thoughts. And it wouldn't surprise me entirely if he binned it and everyone said, yes, he was always intending to bin it. All those who support him always said that. So I'm kind of 75% think he's going to stick with it. But if it gets really dodgy, then who knows? Maybe he'll bin it.
Let us see. It's going to be very interesting finding out. But that's Justin Webb's prediction on the 6th of April. I'm going to write that down. 75-25 are the odds. It's been very nice to have both of you with us on Weekend Newscast. Lovely to see you, Stephanie. Lovely to see you, Justin. Come back soon, but it'll be very nice when Paddy's back next weekend. I'll be back tomorrow with Sunday's Newscast. Tomorrow morning, we're speaking to Kemi Badenoch on the show, the Conservative leader. Darren Jones, the Treasury Minister, joining us with the latest on how the government is trying to manage the damage. So I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks very much for being with us this afternoon. Goodbye.
Newscast from the BBC.